You know, Charlie, when I planned for today's episode, I was telling myself, yes, I will wake up on a Saturday at 8 a.m. to do the recording.
After being
But
out until like 2 a.m. the night before.
actually, I spent my time at home in the late evening after drinking very productively watching YouTube. Okay, like I was watching documentary about, oh my God, a German lol cow. For those who don't know, lol cows, these are basically people, like real people who are just so awkward that people troll them. And apparently there's this lol cow in Germany named Drachenlord, and he is just watched like a short video about him, and I was like, God, my life may hit its low points, but at least I'm not a lol cow. I don't know if you've ever encountered this term.
I haven't encountered the term, but I have encountered a concept. Well, I was also watching a documentary yesterday as part of research for work. I saw a little tip for a
I was
story.
about to say probably you were watching something a little more productive than I was.
Yes, definitely. I saw what I thought was a grain of a story and I wanted to look further into it. And now I've looked a bit further, I'm not convinced it's necessarily anything new. But as part of my research, I found a documentary and it was the only documentary available on this subject. It's about money laundering. It was done by the Dutch national broadcaster, completely in Dutch, no English subtitles. But unlike 90% of expats in the Netherlands, I have actually bothered to learn some Dutch.
Oh my God, you're built different.
Obviously, contextual clues helped, but I could understand, and also, of course, when people in the documentary were speaking Dutch subtitled Russian, yeah, that's fine. I could understand every word in that case. But overall, I could
You
understand
should
it.
be proud. Listen, you should be proud. So, shall we start?
Let's. Welcome to All Out on the Eastern Front, a podcast where we talk about the most important stories from Eastern Europe and Eurasia each week. I'm Charlie Hancock, a journalist at the Moscow Times and writer about European security at the Crisis Europa Substack.
And my name is Kat Shengelia. I'm an MA student at King's College London, trying to figure out how to write my dissertation, a wannabe journalist, and currently God's sleepiest soldier.
You are God's sleepiest soldier like 60% of the time. You need to get your iron levels checked.
No, my iron is probably okay.
Then get your thyroid levels checked.
Sorry, Mrs. I work for the NHS all of a sudden. When I'll need a GP appointment, I'll wait 12 months and get one.
The system is so much less efficient than the Dutch system when it comes to blood tests.
Nah, listen, it's fine. But, what matters is you have a couple stories to start us off with to wake me up. Instead of like giving me a little fairy tale to go to sleep, you're gonna wake me up in horror.
I am. Well, hopefully I'll make you laugh a little bit first when I start with a quick blitz of stories from Poland. The first is that the candidate backed by the right-wing Law and Justice Party, known as the PIS, for this year's presidential election, has found himself the target of mockery after it emerged that he once appeared on television in disguise to promote his own book. Cat's mouth is
No
open.
way. No way. No, bro, what is this like Looney Tunes strategy, bro? What is this?
It's fabulous.
Oh
I
God.
highly recommend you look up the picture because for some reason, when he was in disguise, wearing a hat and with his face blurred, his interviewers decided to wear sunglasses indoors.
Was this maybe like 5D chess kind of thing? Like that they had the glasses on to like play him to expose who he is without explicitly saying that? I don't
Maybe.
know.
Well, this was quite recently. It was only in 2018. So, who is this guy? Karol Nawrocki is a historian who is the head of Poland's Institute of National Remembrance. In 2018, he appeared on television in disguise as his alter ego, Tadeusz Batyr. He says that he had to do this because he was presenting a book in which he'd been researching organised crime, which is obviously dangerous to do, but he's being roundly mocked on social media, in part because the image is just ridiculous, but also because a social media post appeared in which Navroki claimed to have met Batyr. I've spent several years studying organised crime, so Tadeusz Batyr contacted me for some guidance, reads the post, which you can still find online. He thanked me for help with an interesting book, which I recommend. Of course he recommends it.
Wonder why.
Yeah, I wonder what skin he's got in this game. Well, I'm not just bringing this up because it's funny, but it's a good opportunity to talk about how the Law and Justice Party are running their campaign. Navroki is officially an independent candidate because the head of the National Institute of Remembrance is not supposed to be a member of a political party. But the PIS is backing him, so he's their de facto candidate. And this allows the party to have it both ways. On the one hand, Navroki investigates financial crime and communist-era human rights abuses. On the other hand, he has very strongly held, that's a direct quote, views about gay marriage, which is still a political issue in Poland, but he won't speak openly about them.
Well, I mean, it's not rare that we kind of encounter examples. I can't think of them in the UK as much. Maybe Henry Jackson's Society and the Conservative Party, but like in the US, you have the Heritage Foundation, and they're rubbing shoulders with the Republicans. So
The
you do
UK
have
equivalent would probably be something like the Taxpayers Alliance or the Institute for Economic Affairs for the Conservatives, or something like UK Day One for the Labour Party. I think the better parallel would be the recent Wisconsin Supreme Court election, where there you had a Liberal and a Conservative candidate, but officially they're supposed to be nonpartisan. However, you had Democrats and Republicans campaigning for, in Musk's case, paying people to sign a petition in support of this candidate, for which they could win $1 million, because you can't pay people to vote, but you can pay them to sign a petition saying that they're going to vote a certain way.
I think Elon Musk is secretly like actually East European, because like the way he's running stuff is so ghetto. He deserves some sort of East European honorary membership. But go on. So what's with this Law and Justice Party? Because last time I remember talking about them or hearing of them, they got nerfed in the elections, and then we mentioned Poland repeatedly for all of its news. But go on.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly before we get on to that, this isn't actually the first time that the Law and Justice Party have done this, had a quasi-independent candidate who can have it both ways. When Andrzej Duda ran for his first term in 2015, he was an MEP, and they are also supposed to remain non-partisan, but the PIS still had him as their man, and he ended up winning. Navroki is currently second in the polls. According to Politico's average, he's at 23% against the centrist Civic Platform's 35%. But a lot can change in a month until the next election, and it's quite a dicey picture for the centrists, because a lot of people are disappointed that Prime Minister Donald Tusk's government has not delivered as much as they promised they would. And the next Polish story I want to mention is about Warsaw's migration crackdown. Poland has suspended the right of...
Oh no, there is two Polish stories. It's too much Poland. Ali
Cat.
Pierogi, no.
There's a third. We're not even halfway through.
I was just making a lighthearted joke about a second Polish story. And then you went silent and I got really scared. I was like, what did I do? And then you're like, there's a third, and I lost it. Jesus Christ.
Well, Poland has suspended the right of migrants who arrive via the border with Belarus to claim asylum, and has launched a campaign targeting their countries of origin to discourage them coming. Human Rights Watch have condemned this and said the EU should take legal action against Poland if this plan is implemented, but Warsaw says there will be some exceptions for particularly vulnerable groups, like pregnant women. Tusk has pointed the finger directly at Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who has been accused of weaponizing migration against Poland, and thus the EU, and the NATO too, by funneling people towards Poland in order to put pressure on the country's asylum system and public services, and also hit confidence in the government and inflame the far right. We've seen similar tactics being used against Finland for example, in 2023, which brings me on to my third story about Poland this week, because Poland, Finland, and the Baltics have all announced that they'll withdraw from the Ottawa Convention, which bans the use of anti-personnel landmines. It's no surprise that they've done this. Take a look at the map. All of these countries border Russia or Belarus.
I wonder why. I wonder why they would want to, have access to weapons to protect themselves just in case an invasion happens.
Well, that's what they've said. I mean, these weapons are horrible and that have lasting impacts that stretch for decades. There's still advice for when you travel in Bosnia, for example. I remember looking at this when I was when I was in the process of applying for a job in Sarajevo. That even around Sarajevo, they say, stick to the bloody paths that are marked as well as possible. Do not stray from the paths because there is still a risk of landmines.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of memes made about it usually. Like, there's a big subject of kind of lighthearted humor of just Bosnia still being riddled with landmines. And I mean, in Ukraine as well, you have a lot of efforts to remove them. So they are definitely, like, I'm not trying to say they're not dangerous, but goddamn, can they be an effective defensive weapon when needed?
And with the Ottawa Convention, it's been on very shaky ground for a long time. Rather like several nuclear treaties, the United States is not a signatory, and neither is Russia, China, or India. So none of the world powers have signed or ratified this treaty. So where's the leadership on this? And then you have the United States having sent mines to Ukraine for part of their war effort. It does raise questions about why much smaller countries Poland and these are all relatively secure countries in terms of their military by European standards, but why they should not use a relatively inexpensive weapon when the United States and Russia will plant them anyway.
Well, that was the rapid fire stories with Poland, but I can see in the script you are mentioning another interesting Slavic country.
Yes, Slovakia, which hasn't seemed to have got much of a break at the moment.
Well, it's not just that, but also it seems to be following in the mighty footsteps of Putin and the Georgian Dream Party, who we will talk about at the end of the podcast. What are they doing? What are they doing now? How is Slovakia trying to ruin my day?
Well, people have taken to the streets in 30 cities across Slovakia, and the diaspora have been out too, to protest a proposed amendment that, as you said, this might sound slightly familiar, has been compared to Russia's foreign agent law. If passed, this amendment would classify NGOs that directly or indirectly influence politicians, whatever that means, as lobbyists, and require them to prepare transparency reports disclosing anyone who has gifted them more than 5,000 euros in a year. Now, this is different to the Russian foreign agent law in a few ways, and I think this is an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about that, because Kat and I have both worked for companies, and I still do, that have been declared not only foreign agents, but actually undesirable in Russia. Being undesirable essentially outlaws your organization's work in the country by banning having any association with that group, from being employed by and donating to it, to giving a quote if you're a news organization, or even sharing one of our articles. And I mention that because people often get being undesirable confused with being a foreign agent. Foreign agents are still allowed to operate, but their lives are made much harder. In Russia's case, the basic law, before they piled a load of new restrictions on top, worked by imposing really onerous financial disclosure laws on NGOs that receive foreign funding. If they didn't fulfill everything to the letter, they'd be hit with massive fines that would almost certainly bankrupt them. The other way it works is through a chilling effect. The term foreign agent carries a lot of Soviet-era baggage, and I mean, even if you don't have that cultural heritage, it makes it sound like you're a spy. You're a traitor. Advertisers cut ties with you. Venues refuse to host your events. If you're a media outlet, sources are unwilling to talk to you because they think they'll get in trouble. And people may not want to read your articles because they have a big sign on the top that says, this content was produced by an organization performing the function of a foreign agent.
Yeah, I mean, my dad is a foreign agent in Russia, and I worked for Khodorkovsky Live, who are also foreign agents, and sources would be scared to talk to us, even though it's not illegal. Like, there is no ban in Russia or some sort of fines imposed. Even when we would tell these sources that they would be anonymous or their names would change. And it's like for the stupidest stuff. Like, there was a story of like a tram in Russia that went haywire, and like there were passengers inside, and the tram operator lost control of it. It's like not even like a political news story. And when we finally found some sources to talk to, too, because it was like a huge thing, or when we tried to speak with people in the aviation industry to talk about like what's going on with Russian aircraft.
Hasn't it?
Yes, I love planes, okay? I love them.
You get on with my family so well.
Oh my God. We have a lot to talk about. But when we tried to speak with these sources, they were all scared of speaking with us because they're afraid that, the FSB could come knocking. If you post on Facebook, if you write a comment, if you publish a video, you have to put this like fucking Star of David tier sign saying, this post is made by foreign agent, write your full name with
And
your
there are
patronym.
regulations about how big that text has to be, so you can't put it in
That
a really small font and tuck it away.
It's so unlike, like, let's say, TikTok beauty gurus that can hide away somewhere a hashtag saying what they're advertising. You can't do that. You have to put that first thing in capital letters, and he still gets fines.
And if people think that you're a foreign agent if people think that you're a traitor, that's a target on your back. And there have been cases of individuals who've been declared foreign agents, like Kat's father, or of organizations who have had that designation being attacked, having their offices or their homes broken into, not even just by the authorities, by vigilante groups.
So my father worked for Echo of Moscow for most of his life in Russia. Now, Echo of Moscow was like, I think, one of the first or the first independent radio stations that have come out of Russia.
I believe the first.
Well, there you go, the first. And he worked there until it pretty much got shut down shortly after the full-scale invasion started. And the chief editor of this newspaper, he's a very shady, mysterious character. But long story short is that someone after I think it happened after the full-scale invasion started, he's also a foreign agent, and someone threw a pig's head at the door of his flat and like spilled pig's blood everywhere. Now, the pig is no coincidence. He's ethnically Jewish.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, and he looks the part, so go figure that, they picked out a pig to do this. So I wouldn't say that being a foreign agent is the end of your life, right? Like, you
Definitely
can
not.
live, but it does present like difficulties for your work. And I mean, it makes sense. It's like the first step in the repressive regime. So now Slovakia is turning to the same thing.
It's different, I will say.
But the title is still there,
Well,
though,
yes, that's my point on this. So in every case, when one of these laws have been introduced, you have the government saying, oh no, this is not the same as Putin's legislation. And the letter of the law is different. I mean, that rule where you have to put a big sign on saying this material is created by a foreign agent, that was not in the original foreign agent legislation in Russia. It was added years later, and then they piled more and more restrictions onto it. But that doesn't mean that it can't still have this chilling effect by marking organizations out, particularly as Fico has had years of anti-NGO statements within Slovakian politics and was openly delighted at the end of USAID funding to European civil society groups. So his intentions here are relatively easy to read. And I don't think so far that he has said that the United States has foreign agent laws and therefore what he's doing is all right. But I remember Georgian Dream saying that last year, when the protests took place in Georgia. And I think it's worth drawing a distinction there because the United States Foreign Agents Registration Act only applies to people and organizations who are actively performing the function of or working for a foreign government. So you can, of course, have lobbyists, but you also have organizations like the Japanese Tourism Board, who are registered under this act. It isn't looking at any NGO that happens to receive foreign funding, which an awful lot of NGOs do, and then saying you receive funding from abroad, therefore you are an agent of a foreign state trying to gauge influence. That's not me trying to downplay what is happening in Slovakia. I mean, the whole idea of NGOs that can indirectly influence politicians, that is extremely vague.
It's very funny that they would complain about receiving foreign funding when Orban is a known, as I call at this point, welfare queen that receives a lot of EU funding. It just doesn't seem to go into actually needed infrastructure projects. But, I digress.
Well, this week, Hungary, we'll just quickly say before we move on to Kat's story, announced that they are quitting the International Criminal Court.
I guess we could do it right now. Well, since we mentioned Hungary, I'm gonna steal your Hungary coverage and quickly discuss what's happening there. So, Hungary has announced its decision to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, becoming the first EU member to do so. This move coincides with a state visit from, guess who?
Netanyahu.
Good job. So, he has an ICC arrest warrant for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in his crusade against, seems like not just Hamas, but Palestinian civilians too. And with the withdrawal announcement, it came just hours after Netanyahu arrived in Hungary. And there was an interesting reaction by a bunch of different countries, but I want to point out the reaction by Annalena Baerbock, who is the foreign minister from Germany. Now, this podcast is not about Germany. We usually don't mention it, but Germany is still committed to the ICC, and Baerbock criticized Hungary's move, saying that it's a bad day for international law. It is a bit interesting because Baerbock has been bullied quite a lot for her kind of very robotic pro-Israeli stance. So it's a bit weird that you are committed to Israel and you don't want to critique Israel and you don't want to critique Netanyahu and etc. But now when Orban is involved, it's bad. So again, I'm not an expert on Israel or Palestine. I'm not an expert on domestic German politics, but you have to clip these problems at the root. If there is ambiguity with what the stance on Netanyahu is, it's a little bit difficult then to have grounds to critique Orban for it. I just hope, I'm saying this sarcastically, that Hungary won't have to, one day maybe issue a request for international bodies like the ICC to persecute after somebody, because it's like a double-edged sword, because it's cute to leave all of these organizations that require extra accountability from you, but then suddenly one day you may need them.
Well, we were talking earlier about the Ottawa Accords and how the United States is not a signatory to that. The United States is also not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, to the Rome Treaty.
Neither is Russia, China, North Korea, and Israel as well. I mean, there's a lot of
That's right, and its teeth seem to have been blunted in recent years because, well, unsurprisingly, there is an ICC warrant out for Putin's arrest. Then he went to Mongolia, which is a signatory of the Rome Treaty, and what happened after that? Absolutely nothing.
I don't remember who I had this discussion with, but I still think it's important that you have labels like this put on you, though. If you see a guy on Tinder and his profile says, have an ICC warrant issued after me, that's
they should
not a guy you
absolutely
wanna
say that.
Yeah, like a foreign agent thing.
And there are still some meaningful signs. For example, I'm going to wave the flag for the country that has adopted me for the past years right now, the Netherlands, where the ICC is based in The Hague. The Netherlands have said that they would arrest Netanyahu if he landed on Dutch soil.
Well, I'm not sure if he will. It seems like he, like Putin, picks where they travel carefully. I want to move on to a story that unfortunately takes a very dark turn. It's, I think, the highlight of
You make it
stories
sound like
coming
you
out of.
haven't just spoken about a dark story, Kat.
Well, I mean, there was a funny side to it. There is no funny side to what we're about to talk about. So this week I planned to focus on a couple places, which I did my best to, but I decided to shift my focus back to the places most familiar to me. So on Friday, yesterday, a Russian missile strike on the Ukrainian city of Kriviy Rih resulted in the deaths of at least 18 people, including 9 children. So when I went to bed, it was 6. This morning, it's 9. The attack targeted a residential area, causing significant damage to apartment buildings and igniting fires. According to local officials, the missile exploded in the air. Over 30 individuals, almost 40, among them a 3-month-old baby who unfortunately perished, were hospitalized due to injuries sustained in the strike. Now, in the aftermath of this devastating attack, 2 things happened, both of which I want to point out. First was the Telegram post by the Russian MOD, the Ministry of Defense. Quote, important, in big, they had it in big letters.
Важно.
Важно, yeah. At 1849, a high-precision missile strike with a high explosive, high precision. With a high explosive charge was launched at the location of a meeting with unit commanders and Western instructors in one of the restaurants in the city of Kriviy Rih. Well, we Ukrainians write Kriviy Rih, Russians write Kriviy Rih. As a result of the attack, the enemy lost up to 85 foreign servicemen and officers, as well as up to 20 vehicles. I don't think I need to comment further. No evidence, obviously, was provided. Videos appeared showing parents crying over their children's bodies, a mother comforting the hand of her teenage child who is covered by a metallic shawl as rigor mortis sets in. These were kids. 3 months old. The baby just came out, and its life already been snuffed out. The teenage boy who probably had plans with his friends. But in the mind of the MOD, they shapeshifted into foreign servicemen and vehicles. Across the oceans, however, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed the ongoing peace negotiations, if you can call them that, between the U.S. and Russia concerning Ukraine. Speaking in Brussels following discussions with NATO allies, Rubio emphasized that the U.S. is evaluating Russia's commitment to a peaceful resolution, saying, quote, we're testing to see if the Russians are interested in peace. Their actions, not their words, their actions will determine whether they're serious or not.
How's that test going?
Thanks, Captain Obvious. That, however, does not explain the visit of Kirill Dmitriev, head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, who recently visited D.C. to engage in discussions with U.S. officials, including Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, who's been, sort of given the responsibility to deal with Russia and Ukraine. Dmitriev spent his time highlighting the potential collaborative initiatives between 2 nations, encompassing areas such as rare earth mineral mining. Because if you remember when the U.S. announced its intentions to go after the rare earth minerals in Ukraine, Putin came out because he's a complete cock, right? Unlike what Russian nationalists may think.
We have more. Maybe you should
Yeah,
make
we
agreement
have
with
more.
us.
Maybe make agreement with us instead, which I think that there was a reason he did that, mainly because he wanted to devalue Ukraine, because by saying make a deal with us instead of Ukraine, he further devalues Ukraine, taking away its power in negotiations so that it can't even levy whatever resources it has. And there's so much I want to say, but I think that so many of these stories, they speak for themselves. Recently was the anniversary of the liberation of Bucha, and a lot of Ukrainian social media was filled with calls of desperate residents in Bucha, like, for example, a grocery store security guard who, got shot, and he calls 112, which is the kind of European equivalent of 999 or 911. And, he's saying, I've been shot, I can't feel part of my body, and the person on the line, the emergency serviceman, the service worker, she's saying, look, in the areas where they're shooting, we can't go. Because even in the early days of the invasion, the trend of shooting at civilians, shooting at ambulance cars, it was there, it was happening. And now it's happening again. And what frustrates me the most, is Trump doesn't want to recognize ever. Sorry for going on a tangent, but I don't know how else not to go on a tangent because somebody lost their fucking children. But Trump doesn't want to recognize he's incorrect. And the most devastating thing for him in relation to Russia and Ukraine, as pointed out not just by me here, but by Russian opposition politicians like Katz and Ukrainian analysts and everybody else, is that because he is unwilling or unable to even fathom to recognize that Putin is playing him, he is unwilling and not ready to change his mind to start going after Russia proper, not just by enforcing sanctions, but also by giving Ukraine weapons. I also don't understand when there is going to be a tipping point for Trump, because Trump established a strong power vertical. What he says is law, and whatever Rubio says, I don't care about it, because it's until Trump changes his mind that we will continue to have this situation where Ukraine, that already bowed down, that already agreed to Trump's demands, whose president was humiliated in the White House by Trump and Vance. You know, Ukraine is in a position of having children killed, and Russia says, yes, we will agree to everything, and then proceeds to strike a playground.
I think a lot of people have forgotten about the early days of the war, how terrifying, uncertain, and fast everything was. If you have forgotten about this, I mean, there are documentaries you can watch. I also really recommend Simon Schuster's biography of President Zelensky, The Showman. I think it's a very fair book. It's far from a hagiography, and a lot of people think this is an extremely critical examination of Zelensky's character and career. No, I think it's incredibly fair. I think it was just released after there was nothing but lionization, and that people were surprised by that. But you have anecdotally, from talking to people who don't follow the war and politics as closely as Kat and I do, I think for a lot of people, the war in Ukraine has become an abstraction. Almost. So people see pictures of strikes on cities, and then maybe they look at the death toll, and that the death toll in Kriviy Rih recently is one of the highest recently.
It's one of the highest since like the start of the invasion.
Yeah, often only, I say only, it's horrendous. Often there's a couple of deaths per strikes, and that maybe a dozen or so injured. And people see that, and then they look at maybe pictures from Gaza and see the numbers there, and then think, well, life in Kyiv is people are going to work, people are going to the shops, and aren't even running inside at the air raid sirens anymore. So they don't consider it being so serious, and they can't remember, maybe they don't want to.
I can't bring myself to still, and hell, I wasn't even in Ukraine at the time. I was a student in the US, but I can't bring myself to watch, like, for example, Mariupol. I can't.
Yeah.
I saw a snippet of it and I was like, fuck, and I turned it off.
That's the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol, which I recommend if people haven't seen it. I recommend that they do, because it is so horrendous, but also I do not blame somebody who can't watch the whole thing all the way through.
Literally, just as you and I are talking, my dad sent me on WhatsApp. I just opened on my computer. He sent me a video of the scene that I described of the parents. And my dad writes, quote, "I will never forgive and forget what these bastards are doing." And this is a man who survived like part of the occupation.
Yes, well, we're going to talk a bit more about Ukraine on this podcast with Kat's guests for this week. So would you like to introduce them?
Today on the show, well, rather, we recorded yesterday, but at the time of publishing, it's today. I will be joined by someone whose expertise sits at sort of the intersection of military strategy, humanitarian work, and global security. Hamish De-Bretton Gordon, of all people. I'm saying that like it's a negative, and I was trying to sound positive. Jesus. He is a leading authority on chemical and biological warfare. He's a frequent contributor to our distant relative of a podcast, Ukraine the Latest,
which we're both alumni of, and
yeah,
hi guys,
Illumina.
we should say hello to the boys.
Yeah, hello to the boys. Big up, big up. And he's also a frequent contributor to the Telegraph newspaper itself. He spent over 2 decades in the British Army. He was commanding officer at the UK Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Regiment and led NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion. He also since then has been involved in humanitarian efforts throughout Syria because of chemical attacks in Syria, and frequently visits Ukraine as well. So this week, an article of his caught my attention, which is why I decided to have a chat with him, and he kindly agreed. And we spoke a little bit about Trump, a lot about Ukraine, and I tried to, figure out whether there is a way out of the sort of the many deadlocks that are plaguing this war. And so here's the interview. Hi, Hamish. Thank you so much for coming, or should I refer to you as Mr. De-Bretton Gordon? And you even have a royal title, which makes me very, very intimidated.
Not at all. It's Hamish, and thanks very much for having me on.
So, Hamish, an article that you've written recently, and you've been invited to a couple places to talk about it, is about the turning tide against Putin. I'll just honestly read the title of it because I think it speaks for itself. Quote, "Whisper it, but the tide might just be turning against Putin. The American president has lost patience with the Russian leader. So has his own people. Now, because I don't want to be a broken telephone, would it be polite to ask you to kind of retell your main point? Because I've had a lot of questions, because you're not the first person, especially when it comes to looking at Russian side of the internet and political scientists and the opposition, to talk about that people might just be after Putin's neck.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, hopefully a pivotal time at the moment. And there are a whole host of issues here. Let's first look at the US relationship with Putin and Ukraine, and particularly Trump and his new team. For the last 6 or 7 weeks, when Trump has been trying to flex his muscles, and of course, let's remember, before he was elected, he did say he'd end this war in 24 hours. That clearly has not happened. And a lot of the reason for the last 6 weeks, Trump and his associates, like the Defense Secretary J.D. Vance and Wickoff, the envoy to Ukraine, appear to have been supporting Putin and the Russians rather than Ukraine. So it's had two effects, I think. The most important effect, it's led Putin to believe that he's actually winning. And then we had the leaked signal messaging app, which was when the Americans were attacking the Houthis in Yemen. And that was all published. And that within that as well, senior American politicians were talking about pathetic Europe and how they were fed up of helping Europe, and that they weren't going to help Europe in future. So if you're Putin sat in the Kremlin, you suddenly think, right, well, actually, I'm doing okay here. I'm winning, and the Americans are not going to come to the aid of Ukraine. So to push on. But having said that, the background, before we get on to sort of put Trump's change of mind, the background is the Russian economy is in dire straits. Interest rates are ghosting 23%. Inflation is in the mid to high 20s. The only thing keeping the Russian economy going is building tanks and bullets and by selling cheap hydrocarbons, oil and gas. It is also apparent that Russia has suffered unbelievable levels of casualties. Some people are saying up to 1 million dead and injured. Now, that is unbelievable. And when we look at the turning tide, people may not remember, but it was the mothers of Russia who forced Russia to withdraw in defeat from Afghanistan in 1984, when they lost 17,000 soldiers dead. And lots of people have been going, crikey, what has changed? Well, recent murmurings have now leading to the article that I wrote in the Telegraph. And if we just unpick it slightly, I understand from Russian experts in this country that the reason the mothers of Russia had not risen up hitherto is that actually conscripts in Russia get paid a lot of money to go to the front line. huge amounts compared, way above the living wage. And because of that, a lot of people in Russia don't like the soldiers because not only are they paid a lot of money, but they're also criminals. They've emptied the jails.
I actually wanted to add that there's been a recent trend of women on Russian podcasts and social media actually talking rather proudly that if you need quick money, you can always marry a soldier who will likely die in the front line. And these women were seen talking on a podcast and then laughing about it. So it's quite an open secret that whether you're a woman trying to marry a soldier or you're a soldier yourself, it is a quick cash scheme, although, the cost is very high should you get shot.
Well, that's right. And in addition to that, what Russia is not doing, the Russian state is not paying compensation when these soldiers get killed. So, some of the women that you're talking about who may have married a soldier hoping for a big payout are now not getting it. And the mothers who were getting big payouts are not getting it. So there's been some documented stories, particularly in the Sun newspaper recently, of these mothers, approaching Kremlin, sending letters to Putin saying, this is not right. So suddenly, or not suddenly, but there is a swelling under a sort of current that actually the mothers of Russia are beginning to complain about this. And only in the last couple of days, Putin has announced a mobilization of 150,000 conscripts. Now, this is the biggest he's ever done. When he tried to mobilize about 100,000 conscripts at the beginning of this war, a lot of Russian patriots fled the country. So this is going to go down very, very badly. So whisper if you dare. So that is a key element. We saw one of Putin's limousines blown up near the Kremlin last weekend. And also allied to that, we saw Putin's bodyguards being frisked for weapons before they went to protect him. So it is clear that Putin is paranoid about people around him trying to take him out. And these sort of things just sort of underwrite that. And the final element to this is that Trump has now turned on Putin. Over the weekend, he used some very undiplomatic. He said he was pissed off with Putin. And that was pretty stark, real change of direction. So Putin has got all this pressure coming from within. He knows he's running out of soldiers, and he's getting through because he doesn't train them. He just throws them to the front line. The UK Ministry of Defence update last week was saying Russia was losing 1,500 soldiers a day dead on the front line. It's just unsustainable. And if Trump really is pissed off with Putin and is going to turn the screw, then any hope. And we've seen all the ceasefire sort of attempts over the last few weeks really sort of go absolutely nowhere. And hopefully Trump, once he gets his nose out of the tariff trough and starts looking at other things that he can do rather than just crash the world economy, he might well decide that that creating a peace in Ukraine is something that he must do to try and, save his reputation. Not that he seems too worried about his reputation. So when you put all those things together, you then sort of realize that, Putin must be on thin ice. Putin also, although having said that, Russian dictators who fail don't generally, live a happy long retirement. And Putin, age 72, sort of realizes that if he messes up now, that's him. He doesn't need a dacha by the coast somewhere to live out his retirement, because his retirement will probably be pretty short.
It's actually very interesting to kind of see a very similar discussion taking place, because I speak both Russian and English as kind of my main languages. And a lot of the things you talked about immediately made me think about two people in particular on the Russian political side, which is first off, Maxim Katz. He's an opposition politician. He's currently living in Israel. And one of the things he talked about actually is exactly what you said, which is because Russia isn't a democracy, there is no option for a happy retirement if you fail. It's a zero-sum game. And so, it seems to me that scholarship in both the sort of East and the West, proverbial East and the West, is sort of coming jointly together toward this one point. Because I know, like Liz Truss, for example, I know as a non-British person, so I'm treading carefully, is like super unpopular, but she at least gets to retire. She doesn't just get shot. We don't know what's going to happen with Putin. But the other thing that made me think of the second person is Valery Solovey. He's a historian and political scientist in Russia, and even the Wikipedia article about him admits that he's a conspiracy theorist, because basically since the start of the war and before, every 3 days, he would go onto some podcast or some YouTube channel and say, Putin is already dead. We are seeing his clones. Actually, he will die in 2 weeks. And then the 2 weeks passes and he just starts blocking everybody on Facebook who point out, what the hell are you talking about? But what makes you think that this time is different? You seem to be suggesting two things at the same time, understandably so. One, that the system is very, very entrenched in this power vertical, that the money is good and there are a lot of people in Russia who need money, right? On the flip side, you're speaking about a growing tide against Putin because the costs are so high. What could possibly finally unravel this situation? I need some light at the end of the tunnel so that, I don't live my whole life with Putin as my one only Russian president.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you're right. You make a good point. I think one of the things Trump said the other day is really important in this respect. And we know that Russia has been sanctioned and sanctioned and sanctioned. But I mentioned at the beginning the hydrocarbons. Russia is still getting a lot of hard currency from selling cheap oil and gas to China and India and places like that. Now, as part of Trump's tariffs, bizarrely, he hasn't put any tariffs on Russia. I mean, I don't suppose America buys much from Russia, and no doubt anything that Russia buys from America is through the black market. But if Trump could prevent Russia selling oil, that would be a severe blow. And Trump has talked about that. So that is where Putin is getting his money for his weapons. And, although people think, oh, well, he can just print money to make weapons and ammunition. Well, comes a stage where you just actually can't do that. And he's relied on people like the Iranians, which is a really interesting piece. You might have seen that Iran is withdrawing its support to the Houthis. Iranian militias, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis and its militias in Iraq have all pretty much been destroyed. And now Iran is desperate, worried that America is going to take out its nuclear program. And it can't rely on Russia anymore because, Russia can't give it air defense missiles because it needs them itself. Russia really can't help at all. All Russia just wants drones and stuff from Iran. So, a once reliable ally, Iran is just not the force it was. It's been completely denuded. So, when he looks around for help, his closest and most reliable ally is the North Koreans. I mean, for God's sake, Kim Jong-un is his best mate, who is another deluded dictator. And although North Korea has sold 10,000 souls to Russia for God knows what, it seems unlikely now that they're going to give any more. The reason behind it is I think so much is stacking up against him. Trump could really precipitate his fall more quickly by cutting off his oil and also by providing more military capability to Ukraine. But the ambiguity and inconsistency coming out of the White House, to me, is the one thing that is keeping Putin going at the moment. And what is happening in Europe, at last, Europe has got galvanized and realized that it's paid lip service to its own defense for the last 30 years and is now building up its force. Now, that should be enough to finish Putin eventually, but it's going to take 2 or 3 years at least before a European force is capable to not threaten Putin. But one of the main reasons he invaded in February 2022 is when he looked west, he saw no conventional deterrence because Europe had forgotten about it. So that will take time. So there are tangible things that the Americans could do to hasten his demise. Whether they will or not, we'll see over the next few months.
we'll talk about Trump a little bit more because he's in many ways an enigma, not just to like someone like me, but to you and to everybody else. No one really knows what his next move is. But I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine. So the UK announced that it wants to form a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. Now, Keir Starmer, he organized a summit. There was a lot of talking around it, and everyone got really excited that there finally might be some well-armed third parties monitoring the situation. But even your colleagues at the Telegraph, they seem to have their doubts. First, because rumors have it that the US wants basically nothing to do with this coalition. Even if Marco Rubio said that US is committed to NATO, everyone from Germany to the UK have said, no, we need like some form of US backing. And your colleague, and gosh, I hope I pronounce his name right, Con Cowlin, he wrote, quote, Trump is right to think Europe is a joke on defense. Starmer and Macron may be speaking tough, but the coalition of the willing looks set to add up to zero. Can this complicated not be unwind? Because
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I don't agree with what Con said to start with.
I didn't imply you did. I just want to know, but he also writes for the Telegraph, and his
Yeah,
article
yeah,
also caught
yeah.
my attention.
I was with General Zaluzhny yesterday down in Dorset, who's the current Ukraine ambassador to the UK and also a previous commander of the military and somebody tipped to maybe replace Zelensky. And he was very quietly upbeat. His resolve that Ukraine will prevail. Of course, he was also there to thank the British military for the training and support it had given. But I got the impression, speaking to a lot of British and coalition of the willing planners down there, that an awful lot of work has gone on. They have been planning it for ages. And within the coalition of the willing across Europe, there are enough fighter jets, there are enough tanks, there are enough artillery pieces, there are enough drones to provide a really powerful force. Now, in the perfect world, it would be underwritten by American firepower. But if that's not available, then we've got to do it alone. And I think people are confident that they can do it. I mean, if we look at air power, which is a key element to it, the European countries are putting together a force of about 140 fighter jets to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, I personally think they'll be able to do that. I mean, the Russian Air Force is as a poor state as the Russian Navy is, and to affect the Russian army. So I don't think that Russians could oppose that. Similarly, the level of lots of training has been going on with British, French, and Nordic countries with tanks and all the other elements you need for combined arms warfare, far outmatching what Russia has. So yeah, in an ideal world, the Americans would be there as the big backstop and would be part of it. But if they're not going to be there, what Starmer and Macron are saying at the moment, and hopefully what Putin will believe, is we can provide a sufficient force to stop Russia and enforce a ceasefire. And I personally think they can. So I don't agree with Con and others who are saying it's not. And I think if you asked General Zaluzhny, he would think that that was the case too.
I just want to ask a follow-up question to this. My professor over at KCL of Theory and Practice of War, David Betts, one of the things he pointed out in a couple of classes was the fact that, maybe compared to the past, the willingness of public in a variety of Western states to fight in a war, hell, to fight even to defend their own country, is very, very low. Maybe the technology is there, but are there the people? Because if, for example, you have British troops, and please do correct me if I'm wrong somewhere in my line of logic, but imagining if you have French or British troops on the ground in Ukraine who suddenly get shot at, that would mean a resumption of the conflict with involvement of Western troops. And I don't think by, all the LBC callers I'm hearing that it's a popular idea to have, British men dying on the ground for Ukraine. So which one is it? Is there, for example, a potential that Europe will offset this with its high spec, high tech weapons to make sure that less people die?
Well, I don't agree with your professor to begin with. It's not unsurprising. But again, I don't agree that, lots of people are saying, because young kids these days are so woke, and they're not interested in fighting. They don't want to fight and all the rest of it. Crikey. That's been the same since time immemorial. Nobody wants to fight. I spent the last 37 years of my life on the battlefields of the world, and I've seen it all. And, people might think, oh, because you've done that, you like fighting. I don't. I hate it. I avoid it at absolutely every cost. However, I know, like, these kids will learn that sometimes you have to. And, it's been the same. Certainly, we look at Britain. Nobody wanted to fight the First World War, but they did. Second World War, exactly the same. The whole of Britain was involved. There were many people who absolutely were saying the same things then as the kids are saying today. We're not going to fight, but you have to. And it's amazing how few conscientious objectors you actually get in the end. You might feel that half the youth in this country would be conscientious objectors. Well, they wouldn't. When push comes to shove, they will fight. And I think it's the same in Europe as well. So it's an excuse, or it's an argument being used, particularly by the ultra left wing across this country and across Europe. But actually, I think it's part of the narrative, the sort of Russian narrative, as it were. Unfortunately, there are too many people in this country and across Europe believing Russian conspiracy theories. And of course, Russia is absolutely first class at propaganda and disinformation. And unfortunately, people suck it up. I mean, there are some quite sort of, I'm not saying that your professor is one of them, but there are a lot of academics in this country. There are a lot of ex-politicians, there are a lot of ex-military people. And bizarrely, quite a lot of them who have served in Moscow in various posts, who get a severe attack of Stockholm syndrome and seem to gulp up information and propaganda coming out of Russia as though it's fact. So, yeah, I don't hold any sway that British young men and women would not fight. I'm sure they would.
It's actually interesting you're speaking about people who served roles in Russia, because I'm not going to say the name. I'll tell it to you after we stop recording. But a certain person who worked as in a very, very high position in the American embassy in Russia has actually, like, I have him added on Facebook, and it follows precisely the thing you're talking about, which is this Stockholm syndrome. Like, his heart is in the right place when it comes to Palestinian civilians not getting killed. Understandable. I don't think anybody likes civilians getting killed. But when it comes to Ukraine, it's Russia today to the fullest. And I'm so confused about that phenomenon, because what happened when this person was in Russia? Was he transformed by simple conversations, or is there something more nefarious to it?
Well, exactly. I mean, there are many people who think that Putin's got something on Trump, and it's well documented that, Russian oligarchs bailed Trump out, when his hotel chain went bust. But, that's something else.
There is one quick question more regarding your expertise and on the topic of intervention. Now, you're an expert, definitely more than me, on the topics of interventions. And when you were a guest on The Times, you spoke briefly about chemical weapon usage on the front line in Ukraine, and that the usage is way more widespread than you first thought. Chemical weapons were, now I was a kid when the war in Syria began, but what I can definitely remember from watching CNN back then was that the chemical weapons, their usage, was the red line that Assad crossed that led to foreign intervention in the country. Do you think that there is such a red line that could be crossed when it comes to Ukraine? And if so, what potentially is it?
Well, it's a massive subject here, I'm afraid.
Oh, damn, I'm so sorry.
I'll try and put it in as quickly as I can in the time I've got left. Remember, the Obama red line in Syria disappeared. And that's half the reason that Putin invaded Ukraine, because Obama had said that use of chemical weapons would be a red line, and the US would get involved. Then Assad killed 1,500 people in a place called Ghouta, where I was 2 weeks ago in Damascus, and killed 1,500 people. And then Britain and the US decided to do nothing. I was in and out of Syria for 10 years, hunting down Assad's chemical weapons. And I believe he stayed in power so long because he used them. and we did nothing. You wind forward to Ukraine. I'm talking to you from near Salisbury today, where, of course, Russian Secret Service tried to murder Sergei Skripal with the deadly nerve agent Novichok. So we know the Russians have a chemical weapons program. The use of chemical weapons in Ukraine by the Russians is unbelievably high and unbelievably underreported. I was speaking to a number of brigade officers on the front line near Petrovsk last weekend, and they had 5 chemical attacks that day. It's happening on a daily basis. The Russians are using something called chloropicrin, which is designated as a chemical weapon by the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it's also commonly used, known as CS gas or riot control agent. But it has the same effect as a deadly chemical weapon, because it forces soldiers out of trenches where the Russians then shoot them with conventional weapons. And from what I gather, the Russians are only making progress using massive amounts of chloropicrin. Now, hopefully, and rather more slowly than I would have liked, Britain is now giving Ukraine soldiers a lot of gas masks, because bizarrely Britain is the biggest and best maker of gas masks in the world. So, and once they have a gas mask, this will become ineffective. The final piece to that we're all concerned about is if the Russians decide to use more deadly chemical weapons like Novichok, then that should cross a red line. But the Russians know at the moment it's ambiguity. A lot of people I brief in the UK Parliament and the MOD don't realise that chloropicrin is actually a chemical weapon, but it is. But it's been very effective. So we're monitoring it very closely. But if the Russians decided to go to anything more deadly, then that would give, excuse is the wrong word, but would give an opportunity for the West to do something significant about it.
Hamish, thank you so much for coming. I wish that we had more time for more questions, but we hope to have you back on the podcast soon enough.
I'm sure that will be possible. And thanks for having me on.
Well, that was Hamish. Lovely, lovely dude. I hope to have him back soon enough.
Had a real pro on the podcast today.
Honestly, bro, my LinkedIn skills do be working. Thank you, LinkedIn Premium, for being overpriced, but letting me message these kind of alphas of their respective
You can get
sectors.
it for free as a journalist.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Bro, I've been wasting money. What the... Well,
I'll explain to you some other time.
tips.
But Kat, you're going to talk about Georgia again for us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. But yes, I do. Not talk about it extensively, though. But before we leave, I just want to highlight a recently published report by Transparency International in Georgia. It was published on 4th of April. It's a continuation of the coverage that they've been having, reporting on a case involving 11 individuals charged with participation in group violence during recent protests. So Transparency International, they published this big report, and they're sort of highlighting that, not sort of, they are highlighting that the charges that they're facing, they're part of a broader pattern of politically motivated actions across, against protest participants. And the organization, it emphasized kind of the need for impartiality and adherence to human rights standards, which unfortunately, with the way things are going in Georgia, is becoming a particular rarity. For those interested, definitely read the report. It's available on Transparency International of Georgia's website. We will be speaking more about Georgia at a later point. I seriously need to get that device that does jingles, because it's starting to become a bit of a meme that I keep on mentioning Georgia, bro.
Do you know somebody who could perform a little panduri lick for us?
Bro, you keep on bringing up panduri specifically.
I think it would be perfect.
Listen, I've recently gained an obsession with banjos. Like, I just really want to go on top of a truck and just play. You know what? Maybe like a bunch of Ukrainian
America has left a
soldiers...
deep imprint on your brain.
Let's hope I don't get arrested at the border or something like that by the CBP. But I think that one way to gain support among the red states and the Rust Belt in the U.S. is that we need to have like a Ukrainian battalion perform bluegrass banjo on top of like a Ford F-150 near the Ukrainian front line. Can you just imagine that you're a Russian soldier? You come all the way, because Russia's huge, right? So you fly like thousands of kilometers, you reach the front line, and then you get shot by a bunch of guys on a truck where you have 3 dudes playing bluegrass banjo and like a bunch of guys shooting a gun at you. Like, that would be comedy of its own. And I wish I had the skills to shoot a gun proper as needed for frontline.
You didn't learn that out when you were in the US.
Bro, I lived in DC. The only people who have guns in DC is, for some reason, 12-year-old kids recruited into gangs and federal enforcement.
Try harder. Go to Virginia. Go to North Carolina. They're not far away.
Quite expensive to rent a car if you're under 25. So I'm
That's
waiting until I'm 26 to rent a car to not be further scammed by Hertz and all of these other companies. So that is it for this week's information-filled and heavy episode, but it does remind us to hold on to what's precious in this life, because whether you live in a war-torn country or whether you live in a peaceful country, anything can happen. You know what's one theme that I noticed in this episode that it just clicked in my head, but it's a episode, I think, about responsibility in many ways, whether it's like responsibility
I agree,
for...
and that's a responsibility that a lot of us in Western Europe don't necessarily appreciate that we have, because we have never faced direct Russian aggression on our soil. Whereas even very peaceful, very successful countries like Finland they have within living memory experience of invasion, and that is really directing their approach, their far more pragmatic approach.
I think that we can find themes of responsibility even like Hungary. If you're a Russian soldier, right? I don't want to put myself in the shoes of a Russian soldier, but for sake of this example, you have, I guess, a certain responsibility, right? That responsibility does not have to be shooting at a playground. You can't not discuss all of these stories because they bring us into this overarching theme of responsibility, tragedy, and trying to find a path forward. Jesus, my cat is running around in the back, but she has no responsibilities. Margot has none. Her only responsibility is to make sure that she poops in the correct spot. And even then, she manages to have her misses from time to time when she decides to pick out a hairball for me to clean up. But we aren't cats.
I saw a little meme a while ago on Twitter saying, "Посмотри на свою руку. Если она выглядит так," and it had a little picture of a paw, "то вам не надо на работу." I was going to translate it. I mean, a cat will understand that. Is little thing that said, "Look at your hands. If it looks like this," and it had a little cat's paw, then you don't need to work.
True! But you and I have to work, for better or worse.
We do. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of All Out on the Eastern Front. Join us next Sunday, either on Spotify or YouTube. And if you like what we do, the software we use, and our food for our cats, none of that's going to pay for itself. So a link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee pages will be provided in the show notes.
You can get in touch with us via Twitter at Hancock2001 or at Eshenhelia. Jesus, every time I read your username, I remember that you're younger than me. Like, it doesn't click in my head.
I'm an old
bro.
soul. I have been an old soul since I was about 5.
I am an old soul. I'm 1999. Don't let my dad, who was born the same year Stalin died, hear this. He's gonna whip me. If you can't spell our last names or usernames, do not worry. The links to our social media accounts are also available in the show notes below. And on that note, see you next week.